G'day, Hugh here from videsign.com.au, a design company based on the Gold Coast in Australia. Thank you for joining me. Now, often when we're taking photographs, one of the problems that we end up with in our photos is distortion, and that can be lens distortion or perspective distortion. It depends on the lens we're using and the distance where we are from our subject. And often in architecture, or when you're taking photographs of buildings, this becomes very obvious because the building looks like it's leaning at an angle. So I'm going to show you different ways that you can reduce that distortion using Photoshop or Lightroom, and we'll hop in there now and see how that's done.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at both Lightroom and Photoshop and fixing some of these problems that we have with distortion, whether that be lens distortion or perspective distortion. So we'll first of all start in Lightroom, but if you want to jump ahead to Photoshop, that is the time to jump to, and you can see there how to do the same thing in Photoshop. So Lightroom to begin with. I'm going to have a look at both this photo and this photo. So what you can see here is the building is leaning in towards the middle of the frame, and this comes down to using a wide angle lens, and depends on the angle you're holding the camera as well, or the angle that the camera is positioned at, and the distance away from the subject matter that you're taking the photo of. Now we want to fix up this lean because it's not realistic, it's not really what it looks like at all, but it does look quite unusual. So in Lightroom we have a few options that we can use for lens correction. Now we have the basic ability, and you'll always want to enable profile corrections and remove chromatic aberration. So keep the profile corrections always ticked, because you can see the difference between having it ticked and unticked. So we have options available are auto, level, vertical and full. If you choose auto, it's going to have a go at automatically fixing it for you, but it's not perfect. In this case, sometimes it may work perfectly, but not so much in this case. Level is not going to do much at all because the photograph actually is level. It's nice and straight. Now, if we had a problem with it being off level, we could use that. Vertical, so that's important because it is the vertical lines that we're wanting to fix up. So that works quite well. We could crop in the edges and get rid of the white and have a pretty good looking straighter building. And then full really has a significant impact on the picture, and it stretches it out to the full. Now everything there is very straight, but it doesn't look. There's something wrong about that. So we'll leave full off. So that's one option we can use. We could use vertical and crop the edges out and have straightened up our image quite nicely. But we could also do it manually. And then if you want to do this manually, because you want to have more control over it specifically, because if we come back and look at vertical, it isn't perfect. It's still leaning a bit, a little bit, and a little bit. A little bit of a lean there off the straight line. It's pretty close though. It's a pretty good job. But we'll switch that off. We'll switch that off for now, and we could come back to that. We'll do the full manual from the start. So distortion gives us the ability to make the image bulge in or shrink out. We don't really want to play around with that though, so we'll put that back to 0. We really want to work on the vertical because that is the part of the image that the vertical lines which we need to work on, getting straightened up. So if we use the grid to look and then look at the one edge of the building and try and get that looking like it's in a straight line with the grid. And now you can see the corners where the corners of the walls meet and form a straight line down. They are all looking pretty straight, and that was just by sliding the vertical slider to the left until the edges lined up nicely with the grid lines. So from there we could crop out the problems that we have with it, the detail being lost due to the vertical adjustment to the picture, and there we have a much better looking frame from that to that. Now the crop is changing what the perspective of the building is, only just slightly, but our end result is a much straighter looking picture rather than the lean into the middle. So that's a problem with distortion, but we've also got perspectival distortion, which you can see in this particular picture here, which is taken from quite a long distance away. And because we're used to seeing a building looking nice and straight, this photo might be nice and level, but the distortion is causing it to look really weird. So as you get closer to the building, the more you have to tilt your camera to get it in frame, to get the entire thing in frame. And then also wide angle lenses cause sort of these exaggerations. So we can again do a much similar thing. We can come to the lens correction and come to basic, and we have them selected now. Now if we were to go auto, it does a pretty good job with auto. It's still on a bit of slight lean. If we go level, it's not going to have much of effect because the photograph is level. Vertical does a really good job. Now doing that, we lose a bit of this detail here, but that really is pretty vertical. And if we go full again, we have the full picture in frame, but it causes all sorts of distortion problems. So again, we can switch that off and try to do it ourselves manually by again adjusting the vertical slider to straighten up the edges. So you look at each edge of the photo and every straight up and down line within the architecture, compare that against the grid, and you get a fairly good result. So what we can then do is crop, and, crop the picture accordingly, like so. Say OK to that, and you have a much better looking photo. Okay, so let's have a look at doing a similar sort of thing in Photoshop, and we'll use the same two photos to see how we can do it in Photoshop. So I'll start by coming up into filters and come to Camera Raw filter. Now in the Camera Raw filter, we have got this particular transform tool, which is now available, and it is pretty cool. So it's got similar things like work on the level, so it's done a slight level adjustment, but the verticals, similar sort of thing as to what happens in Lightroom. It does a quick adjustment, and then a full does the same thing again like in Lightroom. The guided one, you can actually draw guides, but I don't really know how to do that. If you do, then let me know, but I'm not sure how that one works. But you could use these pre-prepared ones if you like. I'll switch them off, and we'll do the same sort of thing in Photoshop as what we did in Lightroom. So it's clicking on this transform tool and just using the vertical slider to straighten up the edges. Now, unlike Lightroom, we don't have the grid that we can use as our guide. So to me, I think you just would do it by eye and see what you think looks nice and straight. And if you have a look at some of these options, so you've got like the aspect, but we'll keep that at 0, and the X and Y offset, well, we could bring it further across to one side or the other. We don't really need to worry too much about that, because with Photoshop we have a lot of really cool abilities to fill in areas that we couldn't otherwise. And same with the X and Y offset, we could bring it down and you know, get rid of some of that transparent area down there. Now that's looking quite straight. So if we were to then have a look at the crop on it, we could have a look at cropping out the edges, but we won't do that at this stage here. What we'll do is we'll say OK to that and have that in Photoshop. Now what I would do is probably crop it first to a sort of a crop that we're happy with. Somewhere like that, using the crop tool, and then with the magic wand selecting the white, we edit the fill, content aware 100%, and just add in edit fill content aware 100%. Control D to deselect, and there we have a much straighter looking photo. Same thing with this one. You can go to filter, camera raw, choose the transform, and fix up our vertical lines. Do a bit of a rotate. You don't want to do too much. You want it to look fairly straight, both left and right. In this one, I'd even scale it in a bit. Straighten it up just a bit more. And say OK. So that's looking much straighter. In this case, we'd probably crop out a lot of the grass at the bottom there. Enter that, and we'll just fix up the edges with a bit of content aware fill, and we are done. So that's using Lightroom and using Photoshop to fix up your distorted photos, particularly your architecture photos where the buildings tend to lean because of the angle of your camera and the lens you're using. It doesn't always look great when your buildings are leaning like that, and just using some of these techniques to straighten them up is worth doing. So I hope you've enjoyed learning how to fix distortion in both Lightroom and Photoshop. Join me again for another tutorial soon. See ya.